So for my clinical integration project, I decided that it would be easier to have something tangible to represent my theory, as well as all the components that we have to go into it. That way I can visually see how I can conceptualize each client, and then I can also use it to kind of help explain to the clients where things are going wrong or right for them based on the area of their brain, specifically the right, which is purple, or the left hemisphere. So to start off, this is a 3D printed brain that I made. So the right hemisphere is purple, left is yellow. The color will become important later, but it has a hinge on the bottom so it can open about this far. That way it can allow, so it's kind of like looking inside the brain and seeing maybe where certain thoughts are happening from a hemispheric perspective. So what's gonna go in the brain? So I will go into detail on each specific symbol, but each of these is going to represent something specific. Basically, it's going to represent aspects of the client's life, personal, just things that make them up, and so whatever piece represents them, it will go inside the brain, and so then that would give me a visual representation of who that client is as a person, which would then allow me to cater therapy based on what they would need, just specifically as an individual. So my theory is REBT. That will be explained more as I get into the neurological and theoretical approach. But first off, I'm going to explain a little bit about the different symbols. We'll start first with developmentally, so developmental theory. So to represent development, I just have 3 figurines for that, and they are each broken down based on Erikson's developmental stages. So first is the baby. So the baby represents stages 1 through 5 of Erikson's 8 stages. So that's the oral stage, the anal stage, the phallic or Oedipal stage, the latency stage, and the puberty stage. So, for example, this is just going to be used, and as I said, I just have 3 figurines, so the baby will be used, it could be used for clients up to their teenage years, but this is just representing developmentally the stages. So maybe a client comes in and they're on the puberty stage, so they're working to kind of find their own place in their world, developing a new ego, developing their own identity. They would get the baby placed in the brain. For this part, it does not matter which side of the brain. It's just all-inclusive. So the baby would go in the brain. So that way I can visually see that, okay, this client is in either stages 1 through 5. When I would be conducting therapy, I would know for each client which stage the baby specifically represents. It's just more of a visual representation for me to know how to cater therapy based on the developmental stage that they are at. So the next developmental symbol, it's this figurine. It's actually I think it's a wrestler. It was the best figurine I could find for an adult. So this represents adults, male or female, and so that for this project, I wanted adults to represent both young adulthood and adulthood. So similar to the baby, if a client comes in, and this could be whether their chronological age is adult, but even if their chronological age is an adult, they may still be in one of the first 5 stages, so they would still get the baby. But if they are in either young adult or adulthood, they would have this adult figure go into their brain. Again, same thing, just so I can visually represent what developmental stage that they may be at. So the last developmental figurine, this is actually Voldemort. I was not able to find or make with a 3D printer an elderly figurine, and so Voldemort was the closest I could find if you kind of look far away. But this is going to represent the 8th and final stage of Erikson's 8 developmental stages. So this is old age. So this is pretty much, this one is a little more simple, because if this figurine is in the brain, they're only at stage 8, which is old age. And so then this would allow me to cater therapy based again on what developmental stage they're at. So next, just a couple of simple ones. This represents female. This is male. This is just because it is important to represent your client's gender. This can be the gender they were born as. It could be the gender they identify as. Just whichever gender would best suit them. Then it would go in the brain. So to kind of correspond with the developmental stages, say the client is female, they would have the pink clothespin go in. And let's say they're also an adult, so they would have the adult figurine go in. So then in the brain, this tells me that I have a adult female client. Next, just briefly, this wasn't necessarily required of the project, but I did think it was an important component to add. I have a cross, and this is just to symbolize spirituality. So this can be any religion. I just found it easier to have a cross as the general symbol. So if a client comes in and they are spiritual, they have any sort of religion, especially if it's anything different than what I am used to, they would get this in the brain. Again, either side is fine. And this is just to represent and for me to take into account their spirituality while conducting counseling. So the next part is this squishy little ball. This is supposed to represent the world, or Earth. Again, very hard to find a globe to fit to my brain, so this was the closest thing that I could find, but as long as I know what it means, that's okay. But this is used to symbolize culture, and so basically this would just be used when I would have a client who is of a different culture than I am. So if this is in the brain, then I know that I maybe need to do some research on their culture, just to make sure that counseling is still fulfilling what they need and their cultural differences, just because I want to be mindful that they may experience things slightly different than I would. This next piece is a 3D printed model of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So each one, they come apart, and as you can see, we have the physiological, safety, love and belonging, esteem, and self-actualization. Actualization was a little too hard to print, but that is what this one is for. So the point of this is whichever level the client is at, they will get that piece of the pyramid in the brain. So let's say the client is only, they're at the level of safety. So this goes in the brain. So then I know what level of wellness they are at based on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So with this, the goal of therapy is to move the client up from their current level, which for this one is safety. So we want to move them up to the next level. So the goal of therapy is to be able to move that safety out and then put this love and belonging in. That may not happen with every client, but that is essentially the goal. And so that's what I'm trying to show with these separate pieces of the pyramid. So this next part is where we bring in the theoretical approach of REBT with the neurological, And then this is also where I will explain the purpose of having 2 different colors for each hemisphere. So REBT, the main focus is on changing irrational thoughts and feelings into healthier and more rational ones. It's just thought that the main problem that people may be having is just their thoughts are irrational, and then that can lead to irrational behaviors. So changing those thoughts and feelings can lead to a more productive, healthier, rational thought process. So neurologically, in our textbook, it talks about for REBT, it is a bilateral theory, meaning that we use both parts of our brain. Both hemispheres are important. They may process what we're seeing from the environment at the same time, but they're processing it differently. And so dysfunction arises basically when processing is taking place in the wrong hemisphere, so to speak. So if it would be more helpful, or if something should be thought of logically, which logic is going to be the left brain, the yellow side, but a client is maybe using their emotions more, their right brain, that's when dysfunction arises. And so to represent that, I have these pom-poms. These represent thoughts. So the purple ones are the thoughts that should be processed mainly in the right side of the brain. So those go on the right side. The yellow ones are the ones that are processed in the left hemisphere. So that goes in the left one. So with the example I mentioned before, for me, anxiety is the easiest example. So with anxiety, it would be more beneficial for clients to think of things logically, and even though they might try to do that, it's still mostly overruled with the right side of the brain, their emotions, and so then that's where dysfunction arises. So we're going to take one of the yellow pom-poms, so this is going to represent like anxious thoughts, and that's going to go on the purple side. So just as for this example, you can see that there's a yellow pom-pom in the purple side. That's not where it's supposed to be, so we're experiencing dysfunction. And so the point of therapy based on with these pom-poms is to be able to move this yellow pom-pom, work on it, and to get it back into the left side of the brain. And so again, from our textbook from Luke, once that happens, then the brain will be operating as it's supposed to, and so dysfunction should subside after that. So for each client, I didn't want to have anything specific, like label specific thoughts, just because each client is going to be different. So I do have a lot of pom-poms. They do not all need to be used, but for each client, each pom-pom is going to represent a certain thought for that client. And that's just going to be on a client basis. So for each client, I will just know, like with this yellow pom-pom, like this is representing anxiety. Or maybe this is going to represent something like depression. It doesn't matter exactly what it is, just that I know these are the left hemisphere thoughts, these are the right hemisphere thoughts. Dysfunction happens when these thoughts are not occurring in the correct hemisphere. Such as this, and so the point of therapy again will be to move them back to the hemisphere that they are supposed to be in. Therapy may not move them all, we may get most of them like this, there may still be one over there, but overall that would help the client to function better than they did when they first entered counseling. So not only are these just thoughts, but as the thoughts are in the wrong hemisphere, it would relate to REBT because this would be the irrational thought. So this is what is causing dysfunction. It's in the wrong hemisphere, and this is also the irrational thought. And so just getting it over into the correct hemisphere, that's going to occur based on working on that, using the ABCDE model. So being able to take the thought, the behavior, and just replace it with a healthier alternative for the client. That is what is going to get this irrational thought to move over and to become a more rational thought, decreasing the dysfunction in the client's life. So the point of these pom-poms is also to allow me to see where the client is processing most of their information. So in our textbook, it also explains that in therapy, it's important to know how the client thinks, so what hemisphere they're using most often. So once I'm able to kind of place the pom-poms in the correct hemispheres, so let's say we've got most over here, so the right brain has more pom-poms. So this is going to show me that the client is primarily using their right hemisphere for processing information. So then I can also cater therapy because since they're using more of an emotional side of their brain, therapy will need to use more logic-based approaches just to kind of counteract the effect of the client always processing with their right brain. So using the symbols, I will demonstrate how this tool can be used. So let's say that we are working with an adult male. So we're going to have the blue piece for the male and the adult figurine. And again, so the figurine is going to represent adult. I will just have to know based on that client which developmental stage that particular adult is at. Let's also say that this client is very spiritual, so they will get the cross. They will have the same culture as me, so we'll leave the globe out for now. And let's say that they are at Maslow's safety level. So we're going to be working to get to love and belonging. So this client is having some irrational thoughts that should be being processed in their left brain, such as like anxiety, things like that. And so they're having a more emotional response. And so they're processing it more in their right brain. So they're having some dysfunction there. They do have some thoughts that should be in the right brain, thoughts in the left brain. Again, these are going to be specific to the client. So each specific thought can represent one, and then it's just whichever brain right or left it should be in is what it will go in. For this example, they're just right now going to represent thoughts, but for each client they would be specific thoughts. And then maybe they have an irrational thought that should be occurring in their right brain, but it's occurring in their left brain. So based on what I had just talked about recently, it looks like they are processing most of their information with their right brain. It is a pretty close split, but therapy would need to cater more to their logical side. And the point of therapy is going to be to change these irrational thoughts and put them into the correct side of the brain that they're supposed to be in. Again, like I said, we may not get all of them, but this would be a lot more functional than it had been. And so this is just a visual representation for me to quickly see where a client is at. So this would also help me to explain it to a client. I may not include all of the pieces that are specific to them, but based on the thoughts, I would be able to show the client that they're having this irrational thought. It's irrational, it's being processed in the right side of the brain, and so that's causing them some dysfunction. So the point of therapy is going to be to move this yellow piece over to the yellow side of the brain. So then that can just kind of help give the client a visual representation of where they're at, and then what we are trying to accomplish in therapy. So I hope you enjoyed my clinical integration tool. It is just very beneficial to me, and I can definitely see myself using this in the future. I am much more of a hands-on learner, so it really helps to give me that visual representation, and also just actively working with it, moving thoughts around, seeing where they're occurring, where they should be occurring. And I just also think it would be very helpful for clients to be able to see and picture it as well.